Laboratory number 2, particulates, part 1, total and respirable dust sampling. Total dust samples are going to be collected on a 37 millimeter sample cassette. You can see here the individual parts that are used for that total dust sample. You have the inlet or cover, the middle ring, your sample filter, this is actually where your sample will be collected, a support pad to help keep that filter from getting damaged, and an outlet. Notice the outlet portion has this little waffle pattern in it. The idea is to try to get an even distribution of airflow so that as the air flows through your cassette, through your filter, through your support pad, you don't have a restriction on flow in the center. You assemble that, you put the support pad into the outlet part, you put the filter on top of it. Remember, you want your filter to collect your dust before it gets to your support pad. You then attach the center ring and the cover, and you get a 37 millimeter cassette that looks like that. Now, if you're sampling, you're going to want to put a unique identifier on this. For each sample that you collect, you want to make sure that you can keep track of them. There's lots of information that you would collect as part of this process if you're sampling out in the field. Since we're collecting our samples and then analyzing them immediately, we don't always document all those things. Now, that's one sample you're going to collect is the total dust. The other sample we're going to collect is a respirable dust sample. The respirable dust sample has some of the same components. I have my outlet, I have my support pad that's going to go in my outlet, my filter that's going to go on top of my support pad, and a middle ring to hold those in place. But instead of the cover that I had before, I'm going to attach this cyclone. This cyclone allows me to separate the fine particles, the respirable particles, from the non-respirable particles, as long as I operate it at the correct flow rate. Now, the large stuff will get collected down here. This right here is the inlet. The air comes in. It's given a spin. It spins. The large stuff hits the walls because its momentum carries it to the walls. It then slides down and gets collected down here in this button. The lighter stuff stays in the airstream. It spirals out. And so you can see there's another shot of the inlet cassette, the bottom part with the pad and the filter already on it, the center ring attached, and kind of pull the filter out so you can see it again. And then as you assemble that, it ends up looking like this. Again, there's your inlet, there's your button. You'll note in some of the other pictures that this bottom button is red. We actually have a couple of different cyclones that we use, but don't worry about that. The bottom button is just where the dust is collected. All the cyclones that we use currently are required to operate at 2.5 liters per minute. Our dust chamber. The dust in our chamber is a mixture of baby powder and some graphite. The graphite's really there because baby powder is white, and then you can imagine white baby powder on that white filter makes it very hard to see, so the graphite's there just so it makes it easier to see that dust. Here's our dust chamber itself. It's hooked up to house air here. I've got 2 sampling lines that come out and go to my sampling pumps here. In the preliminary one, I talk about how to calibrate your samples, so we're not going to go through that here. I'm just going to kind of show you how to collect the samples. But I'm going to calibrate these before and after with that rotometer that I calibrated previously to make sure that my airflows are correct. If my airflows vary by more than about 10%, I'm going to have to throw those samples out. So you can see our chamber. There's the inside of our chamber. We've got a series of 3 little pipes that run parallel. We've got little holes in them so that when I can turn the compressed air on, it starts blowing dust out. You can see from the surface of this and the surface around it, as we generate that dust, it's pretty dusty. That's why we do this whole thing under the hood. And so now we're going to go through. I'm going to show you a quick attachment so you can see once I get the sampling line free from underneath the dust chamber. Attach that sampling line to your pump. You want to make sure you keep your sample, which sample goes with which pump, straight. You got your total dust sample cassette and your respirable dust samples cassette with the pre-weighed filters that we had weighed previously. We assemble those. The waffle pattern always points to the pump. So you can see the inlets are on the inside of the chamber. There's going to be drawn through the inlets, through the filters, and then to the pumps. By the time it gets to the pumps, hopefully we've removed all the dust so we don't damage our pumps. And so once I turn on my air, should be in about a second here, you'll be able to see the dust starting to rise inside the chamber. And that's just dust being blown up from the dust laying on the ground. And then we're going to very carefully, we're going to make sure that we turn on our pumps at the exact same time as we start our stopwatch. And then we're going to sample for 5 minutes. Now I'm not going to make you sit here and watch that for 5 minutes. So we're going to jump ahead to the completion of our sample collection. So here we can see the ending of our sample collection in the last 30 seconds or so. You can see I've got my fingers on both of my switches so that as my sample counts down to exactly 5 minutes, I'm going to turn it off. Now, if I'm taking a 5-minute sample, those few seconds may be important. If I'm taking a 2 or 3 hour sample where I'm getting 120 or 180 minutes of sampling, a second's probably not going to make that much difference in my sample timing. So we've turned off our sample pumps. Now I turn off the air that's generating the dust in the chamber. We very carefully lift up the cover and take our samples out. Now, since we sampled with a closed-faced total dust sample, we have to be a little bit careful as we take that sample out. Try to look and see inside. You can kind of see the pile of dust in the center. And if you notice in the center of that sample, as you watch as we look at it again, there's a little bit of a white spot in the center. I probably handled that a little too roughly, and I actually sloughed off a little bit of the sample. And now we're going to take the respirable dust sample out. You can't quite see it, but I'm carefully removing the top of that sample before I turn that cyclone over. So I've got because if I don't do that, you'll see it right here. If I had tapped that, I'd have that non-respirable dust fall onto my filter, which would contaminate my sample. So there you can see, again, if you look at that pause, you can see that little bit of white spot in the center of my sample. I probably lost a little bit of my sample because I handled it too roughly. So we got to be careful about that when we collect samples to make sure that we don't damage our samples so that they're accurate. And once we've weighed them, we're going to take them back over to where our balance is. We're going to carefully disassemble them. I've got a little pry bar to help me take my cassette apart. The lift allows me to lift up the cassette gently so I don't knock any dust off my filter. I carefully take that filter out. You can see the support pad, the cover, and all the parts assembled there. I put that on my balance. And I didn't show you this, but we actually weighed the filters in the same manner before we collected our samples. We weigh that filter. Now, don't note the weights and the filters what's showing in our assembly here. You will get your own set of data. It'll be in that same range probably because I generally use data from filters that were from the same lot numbers, plus or minus a decimal point, but it's going to be 0.0 something for your data. So you weigh our filter, do the same thing for our total dust sample. And again, if you look closely, you can see that little divot. Now I think that dust is right here, but you might use the data from a cassette like that with a little bit of caution. Again, you can see it's probably there. There's dust in the center. It's just kind of sloughed away a little bit. And again, the little white center. Weigh that on the filter cassette. And again, don't pay any attention to this number. It does show you what you would see if you actually weighed it, but you're going to have your own data. After we have weighed our filters, we're going to take them and we're going to put them in this desiccator. At the bottom of this, I've got some dry right. It's blue. It turns purplish as it absorbs over time. I put my cassettes in there. Now notice the cyclone's been removed. There was no reason to really put the cyclone back on, so I just put a cover on my respirable sample. Each of those, of course, should have a unique identifier so I can tell them apart. I'm going to let them sit in there for a week, and then I'm going to reweigh them. That's my desiccated weight. The reason I do that is because if you read through the method 500 method for total dust, which is simply applies pretty much to the respirable dust as well, except you're using a cyclone for gravimetric analysis, the method says to desiccate to dryness. When we did our samples, we collected our samples and weighed it immediately. We didn't desiccate it. So the question is, how much error did that add? And so you're going to use that desiccated weight as your expected weight and determine what your error might have been by comparing that to your final weight versus your desiccated weight. That's just a quick run through of how to actually collect the samples for the total and respirable dust samples. Hopefully that helps you a little bit in understanding how to do that. I realize it's not nearly as nice as being able to put your hands on and actually touch and feel and ask the questions as you're doing that, but that's the best we can do right now. So hopefully that helps. You have a pre-part for this lab where I kind of go through the lab in general. You're going to have this part 1. I'm going to do the same thing for part 2 for collection of your biological samples. You'll need to get your data for part 1 and part 2. And there's also a companion slideshow for your biological sample that kind of shows you what the difference between the fungal spores, the pollen spores, and the other stuff that you might see in the biological sample.